The Door, by Robert X. Bishop. It was just another day in Old Town Winchester, Virginia. Joan sat alone in the secret garden, wool gathering. She had loved the name from the first moment she'd seen it, painted on the espresso bar's door, leading to a secluded area out back. Secret garden. It suggested hidden things, private, unruly thoughts that slipped their leashes when no one was looking. The kind of thoughts women her age were supposed to have domesticated by now, trained to heel and sit and stay. The cappuccino in front of her had gone cold an hour ago, maybe longer. The foam had collapsed into itself, leaving a beige ring around the orange ceramic cup like a bathtub stain. She traced the rim with her finger, around and around, her mind drifting as it had been doing more and more lately. Once, as an attorney, her thoughts had moved in straight lines, from precedent to argument to conclusion, clean as geometry. Now they wandered. Now they circled back on themselves, predatory, patient, uninvited. A memory surfaced, My Secret Garden, by Nancy Friday. She had first read it decades ago, borrowed from a college roommate who kept it hidden under her mattress like pornography, which Joan supposed it was, though not the visual kind. It was a catalogue of women's sexual fantasies, the things they thought about in the dark, alone, the desires that lived quietly, politely, beneath the surface of their acceptable lives. The book had unsettled her then, not because the fantasies were shocking, though some were, but because of how easily it gave voice to things women were never supposed to say aloud. She smiled faintly now, remembering. From across the room, she must have looked like any other woman passing time on a Tuesday afternoon. Grey hair cut in a too long for her age style, expensive but understated clothing, the kind that whispered money even when there wasn't much left. A woman who might be waiting for a friend or killing time between errands or simply enjoying a moment of solitude. But something in her expression shifted as she sat there, tightened, sharpened. The smile deepened, turning almost playful, almost predatory. Out front, visible through the large windows, a rainbow flag hung limply in the still air. It signaled an acceptance of something else, something that in her youth had been taboo, how times had changed, how many secrets had been dragged into the light, normalized, celebrated, and yet some secrets remained. Some desires were still too dark for flags and parades. Her gaze drifted to the front door of the espresso bar. It swung the wrong way. She had noticed it the first time she'd come here, years ago. The door opened inward instead of outward, a clear violation of building code. In a fire, in a panic, bodies would press against it from the inside, making it impossible to open. People would be crushed against the glass and frame, trampled, suffocated. It was a death trap, pure and simple. As an attorney, even a disgraced one, she saw it immediately for what it was, negligence, a danger to public safety, a lawsuit waiting to happen. That was it, she thought, her pulse quickening. That was how she would kill her husband. The thought arrived fully formed, like Athena from Zeus's skull. Not a question or a possibility, but a certainty. A plan that had been assembling itself in the dark corners of her mind for months, maybe years, finally stepping into the light. She took a sip of the cold cappuccino. It tasted like chalk and regret. Joan had been diagnosed as mentally ill when she was 14. Her father had been a psychiatrist, a good one by all accounts, respected in his field. He had treated her himself, which even then she'd understood was inappropriate, though no one seemed to care. The pills had started small, something for anxiety, something for sleep. Then came the mood stabilizers, the antipsychotics, the cocktails that changed every few months when the side effects became unbearable or the efficacy waned. "You're a difficult case," he'd told her once. not unkindly. Your brain chemistry is complicated. She remembered his office in the house, the leather couch where she'd lie during their sessions, the smell of his cologne, something woody and expensive, the way his hand would rest on her shoulder, then her knee, then higher, the faded memories of him touching her, appropriately or inappropriately. It had been so long ago, and the drugs had made everything hazy, dreamlike. When she'd finally worked up the courage to tell her mother, she'd been assured it was only her imagination, a side effect of the medication, a symptom of her illness. "Your father is trying to help you," her mother had said, her voice tight with something Joan couldn't name, anger, fear. "You need to trust him." But her mother had divorced him anyway 3 years later, never explained why. Just packed up Joan and her half-sister and moved them across the country, from Connecticut to California, as if distance could erase whatever had happened in that house. Joan's half-sister, her mother's daughter, from her first marriage, had visited once, years later, when Joan was in her 30s. They'd sat in a coffee shop not unlike this one, and her sister had leaned across the table, her voice low and urgent. "He's trying to kill her," she'd said. "Who?" "Dad. He's trying to kill Mom, his new wife, I'm sure of it." Joan had wanted to laugh. It sounded paranoid, delusional, the kind of thing she might have said during one of her episodes. But her sister's eyes were clear, sober, certain. "He's been adjusting her medications," her sister continued. "She's been getting sicker and sicker. The doctors can't figure out what's wrong. But I've been watching him. I've seen the way he looks at her when she's sleeping, like he's waiting for something." Joan had never found out if it was true. Her father had died 2 years later, a heart attack, sudden and massive. His wife had recovered almost immediately after his death, which proved nothing and everything. The memory sat in Joan's mind like a stone in still water, sending out ripples that touched everything. She had met the man who would become her husband when she was 32. It was at a party for some progressive cause, clean water in developing nations or microloans for women entrepreneurs, something like that. He'd been the keynote speaker, a visionary type with wild hair and an infectious enthusiasm. He talked about systems change and paradigm shifts, about how one person with enough conviction could move mountains. Afterward, at the reception, he'd approached her. "You looked skeptical during my talk," he'd said, smiling. "I'm a lawyer," she'd replied. "Skepticism is my default setting." "Fair enough. What do you practice?" "Corporate law. Mergers and acquisitions, mostly." He'd made a face. "So you help rich people get richer." "Someone has to." But he'd laughed, and they'd talked for 2 hours, and she'd found herself telling him things she never told anyone. About her father, about the medications, about her half-sister's certainty that their father had been trying to kill his wife. He'd listened, really listened. Not with the clinical detachment of a therapist or the polite disinterest of a cocktail party acquaintance, but with genuine attention. His eyes had never left her face. He'd asked questions. He'd remembered details. "That must have been terrifying," he'd said, not knowing what was real. It was the first time anyone had acknowledged that particular horror, the uncertainty, the gaslighting, the way her own mind had become untrustworthy. They'd married 6 months later. For the first few years it had been good. He'd continued his work, consulting for non-profits, writing grants, giving talks. She'd continued hers, climbing the ladder at a prestigious firm in Bethesda. They'd had separate lives that intersected in the evenings, over wine and dinner and long conversations about everything and nothing. Then came the mistake. It had been a simple error, really. A decimal point in the wrong place during a merger negotiation. The kind of thing that should have been caught by multiple people during multiple reviews. But it hadn't been, and the firm's client had lost $1 billion. Joan had been fired within a week. "We have to protect the firm's reputation," the senior partner had told her, his voice heavy with regret. That might have been genuine. "You understand?" She'd understood perfectly. She was the sacrifice, the scapegoat, the cautionary tale that would be whispered about in conference rooms for years to come. Her husband had been wonderful about it. "These things happen," he'd said, holding her while she cried. "You're brilliant. You'll find something else." But she hadn't. The legal world was small, and word travelled fast. No one wanted to hire the woman who'd cost a client $1 billion. The interviews dried up. The networking calls went unreturned. Her professional identity, the thing she'd built her entire adult life around, evaporated like morning fog. The depression had come on slowly. Then all at once, she'd stopped getting out of bed, stopped showering, stopped eating anything that required more effort than opening a package. Her husband had taken over everything, cooking, cleaning, paying bills. He'd reduced his consulting work to part-time so he could be home with her more. "I'm going to take care of you," he'd promised. "That's what marriage means." The bipolar diagnosis had come during one of her hospitalizations, after he'd found her cutting herself. Apparently, the depression wasn't just depression. It was the downswing of a cycle that also included periods of mania, though those were rarer and harder to identify. More medications followed. Lithium, Lamictal, Seroquel, the same pharmaceutical cocktail her father had experimented with, now prescribed by doctors who'd never met her father, who had no idea they were following in his footsteps. During her worst episodes, her husband had held her in his arms to prevent her from hurting herself. He'd sat with her through the night, talking her down from ledges both literal and metaphorical. He'd professed his love over and over again, like an incantation, like a spell that might ward off the darkness. On several occasions, he had saved her life, and those episodes had changed everything. He'd become overly protective, suffocatingly so. He'd backed off from his dreams of saving the world and focused strictly on saving her. He monitored her medications. He asked how she was feeling 12 times a day. He watched her with worried eyes, as if she might shatter at any moment. It was love, she knew. Genuine, devoted, selfless love. It was also a cage, and he was a man, just like her father, a man who thought he knew what was best for her, a man who controlled her with pills and concern and unwavering attention, a man who had made her dependent on him, whether he'd meant to or not. The first attempt had been almost accidental. She'd been driving, he'd been in the passenger seat. They were coming back from a doctor's appointment, hers, always hers, and she'd seen the car approaching from the left, a sedan, dark blue, travelling well above the speed limit. The thought had been simple. What if I just pulled out in front of it? Her hands had turned the wheel before her conscious mind had fully processed the decision. She'd miscalculated. Instead of the other car hitting the passenger door, hitting him, it had struck the front passenger side wheel well, spinning their car around in a screech of metal and rubber. The airbags had deployed. The world had gone white and loud, and then very, very quiet. She hadn't been hurt, a few bruises from the seatbelt, nothing more. Her husband had suffered a concussion and a separated shoulder. The seatbelt had dug into his flesh, leaving a purple-black bruise that had lasted for weeks. "I'm so sorry," she'd said in the emergency room, and she'd meant it. Not sorry that she'd tried to kill him. That part felt distant, unreal, like something she'd seen in a movie, but sorry that she'd failed. The accident had bought her over a year of relative freedom. He'd been in too much pain to hover quite so closely. The separated shoulder had required physical therapy, follow-up appointments, a slow and frustrating recovery. He'd been distracted by his own body's betrayal, and she'd been able to breathe. She'd spent that year on the internet. At first, She told herself she was just researching, just curious, just exploring a hypothetical. She'd started with mystery novels, true crime podcasts, forensic science articles. She'd learned about rigor mortis and lividity, about how bodies decomposed and what evidence they left behind. She'd learned about poisons, their symptoms, their detection, their availability. Atropa belladonna, deadly, nightshade, beautiful and lethal. The plant produced tropane alkaloids, atropine, scopolamine, hyoscyamine, that caused a cascade of symptoms: dilated pupils, blurred vision, dry mouth, difficulty swallowing, confusion, hallucinations, seizures, coma, death. In small doses, it had been used medicinally for centuries. In larger doses, it was one of the most reliable poisons in history. The best part? It was surprisingly easy to acquire. She'd found it through a friend of a friend, a Jamaican man who owned a small restaurant in Winchester. He was charming and entrepreneurial, running addiction rehab centers that served as a front for his real business, peddling drugs for a Mexican cartel. Marijuana mostly, but he had access to other things, exotic things. He also dabbled in voodoo, which meant he kept a garden of plants that most people had never heard of. "You want belladonna?" he'd asked when she'd finally worked up the courage to call him. "What for?" "A garden project," she'd said. "I'm interested in historical plants, medicinal herbs." He'd laughed. "Sure, lady, historical plants. I got you." The transaction had been simple, cash, no questions, no records. He'd given her a small potted plant and instructions on how to harvest and prepare the berries. "Be careful with this," he'd warned. "This shit will kill you dead." "I'll be careful," she'd promised. Her husband had been pleased when she'd started cooking again. "This is wonderful," he'd said, after the first meal. "A simple pasta dish with marinara sauce. I've missed your cooking." She'd smiled and said nothing. The belladonna had been in the sauce, just a small amount, carefully measured, not enough to kill, not yet, just enough to begin the process. Over the following weeks, she'd added it to everything: soups, stews, casseroles, anything with strong flavors that could mask the slight bitterness. She'd watched him eat, watched him compliment her efforts, watched him slowly begin to deteriorate. The symptoms had started subtly: dry mouth, difficulty focusing, mild confusion that he'd attributed to stress. Then came the hallucinations. She'd found him one night standing in the kitchen, staring at the wall. "Do you see them?" he'd asked. "See what?" "The spiders, they're everywhere, crawling out of the walls." There were no spiders. He'd taken to his bed after that, too weak and disoriented to do much else. For nearly a week, he'd lain there, sweating and shaking, seeing things that weren't there, speaking to people who weren't in the room. She'd sat beside him, holding his hand, murmuring soothing words, all while calculating how much more it would take. And then, on the 6th day, as she'd watched him thrash and moan, something had shifted inside her. She wasn't ready. The realization had hit her like cold water. She wasn't ready for him to die. Not because she loved him. She wasn't sure she did any more, wasn't sure she ever had, but because she still needed him, needed his income, his insurance, his presence. She'd been so focused on the how of killing him that she'd forgotten to prepare for the after. And there was the life insurance, or rather, the lack of it. They'd let their policies lapse years ago during one of his lean periods. She'd meant to reinstate hers on him, but she'd never gotten around to it. If he died now, she'd get nothing. Worse than nothing, she'd be alone, unemployed, unemployable, with a mortgage and bills and no way to pay them. So she'd stopped. She'd thrown out the remaining belladonna, destroyed the plant, scrubbed the pots she'd used to prepare it. She'd called his doctor, insisted on a house call, described symptoms that sounded like a severe flu or food poisoning. The doctor had prescribed rest and fluids and time. Slowly, Agonizingly, her husband had recovered, and when he'd finally been well enough to sit up, to speak clearly, to look at her with clear eyes, he'd taken her hand and said, "Thank you for taking care of me. I don't know what I would have done without you." He'd fallen even more deeply in love with her after that. The next 2 years had been unbearable. His devotion had intensified to a degree she hadn't thought possible. He'd looked at her the way religious converts looked at icons, with awe and gratitude and an unsettling intensity. He'd told her constantly how much he loved her, how lucky he was, how she'd saved his life. "You're my angel," he'd said more than once. She'd smiled and said she loved him too, because what else could she say? But inside, she'd been screaming. The cage had grown smaller, his attention had become more focused. He'd started working from home full-time, always there, always watching, always asking if she was okay, if she needed anything, if there was anything he could do. She dealt with it the best she could. After all, being taken care of by a man wasn't all that bad. There were worse fates than a comfortable home and a devoted husband. She told herself this over and over, a mantra against the rising tide of rage. But the rage had continued to rise, and then finally, the pieces had fallen into place. The life insurance policy had been reinstated, a hefty one, with her as the sole beneficiary. She'd handled it herself, forging his signature on the application, paying the premiums out of their joint account in amounts small enough that he'd never notice. And she'd received an offer for remote contract work from a law firm in New York. Document review mostly, tedious work that required no creativity or client interaction. But it paid well, and it was legitimate employment. More importantly, it gave her a reason to be distracted, to be busy, to have a life separate from him. For the last few weeks, she'd been especially nice to him, attentive, affectionate. She'd initiated sex for the first time in months. She'd laughed at his jokes. She'd asked about his work with genuine seeming interest. It was all part of her alibi. When he died, people would remember how happy they'd seemed, how devoted she'd been, how unexpected and tragic his death had been. Sitting in the secret garden, Joan constructed the murder in her mind with the same attention to detail she'd once applied to merger contracts. The drug would be the easy part. Not belladonna this time. That had been too slow, too obvious in retrospect. She needed something faster, something that would cause a cardiac event but leave no trace. She'd been researching synthetic cathinones, the chemicals used in bath salts. They caused rapid heart rate, elevated blood pressure, hypothermia, and in high enough doses, heart attacks. They were also nearly impossible to detect in a standard autopsy, unless you were specifically looking for them. She could get them from the same Jamaican contact. He'd been happy to supply the belladonna. He'd be happy to supply this too. The setting would be here, at the secret garden. She'd suggest they come for coffee on a Saturday afternoon when the place was crowded. She'd order for both of them, a latte for him, something simple for her. She'd dose his drink in the bathroom, or while he was distracted, or simply by preparing it herself if the opportunity arose. They'd sit near the front door. That was crucial. Then she'd create the panic. It could be anything really, a fire alarm, a scream, a gunshot, or something that sounded like a gunshot. In the chaos, people would rush for the exit. They'd press against the door that opened inward, the door that violated every safety code in the book. Bodies would crush together. Her husband, already experiencing cardiac distress from the drug, would be caught in the press of the crowd. His heart would give out. The autopsy would show a heart attack brought on by the stress and physical trauma of being crushed in a panicked crowd. The synthetic cathinones would be metabolized quickly, leaving little trace. Even if they were detected, they could be explained away. Perhaps he'd taken something for energy, or someone had spiked his drink as a prank. She would be devastated, of course, traumatized. She'd sue the espresso bar for the negligent door. She'd sue the city of Winchester for allowing such a clear code violation to exist. She'd win both cases. She was certain of that. The door was indefensible. Between the life insurance payout and the lawsuit settlements, she'd be set for life. She'd move to New York, take the contract position, start over. No more husband, no more cage, no more man controlling her with love and concern and suffocating devotion. Freedom. The word tasted sweet in her mouth, sweeter than any cappuccino. That evening, Joan and her husband went to the Mexican restaurant near the espresso bar. It was his favorite place, a small family-owned establishment with excellent Mexican beer and strong margaritas. She'd suggested it, knowing he'd be pleased. Another brick in the foundation of her alibi. They'd ordered their usual, shrimp enchiladas for her, chicken fajita for him, a shared order of guacamole. He'd had 2 Mexican beers, Modelo Especial, drinking them faster than usual. "Everything okay?" she'd asked. "Fine," he'd said, but his smile had been tight, just thirsty. Halfway through the meal, he'd excused himself to use the restroom. He'd been gone for several minutes, longer than usual. When he'd returned, his face had been white as bone, drained of all colour. His hands had been shaking. Joan had felt a flutter of something in her chest, not concern exactly, more like anticipation. "What's wrong?" she'd asked, reaching across the table to take his hand. He'd sat down heavily, his eyes unfocused. When he'd spoken, his voice had been broken, barely above a whisper. "When I went to use the restroom," he'd said, then stopped, swallowed hard, tried again. "There was only blood, sweetheart, only blood." The flutter in her chest had intensified. "What do you mean?" "When I urinated, it was just blood, dark blood, a lot of it." She'd insisted they leave immediately, had driven him to the emergency room despite his protests that it could wait until morning. She'd held his hand in the waiting room, had spoken to the doctors with appropriate concern, had stayed by his side through the initial examination. The ER doctor had been young, competent, and direct. "We need to run some tests," he'd said. "Blood in the urine can indicate several things, some more serious than others. We'll do blood work, urinalysis, and I'd like to get a CT scan." The tests had taken hours. Joan had sat in the waiting room, scrolling through her phone, occasionally looking up at the muted television. She'd felt oddly calm, detached, as if she were watching events unfold from a great distance. When the doctor had finally returned, his expression had been carefully neutral, the look medical professionals cultivated when delivering bad news. "I'm sorry," he'd said, pulling up a chair. "I'm afraid the CT scan showed a mass in your right kidney, a significant mass. We'll need to do a biopsy to confirm, but given the size and appearance, along with the hematuria, the blood in your urine, I'm fairly certain we're looking at renal cell carcinoma." "Cancer," her husband had said. Not a question, a statement. "Yes. We'll need further testing to determine the stage, but I'm going to be honest with you. The size of the mass suggests it's advanced. We'll get you in to see an oncologist as soon as possible." The biopsy had been scheduled for 3 days later. The results had come back within a week. Stage 4, renal cell carcinoma, metastatic. The cancer had spread to his lungs, his liver, his bones. No one would ever know. She would carry her secret garden with her always, a place where dark things grew in the shadows, where the door swung the wrong way, where freedom came at a price she'd been willing to pay. And in 6 months, maybe 12, when her husband finally succumbed to the cancer eating him from the inside out, she would cry real tears at his funeral, would accept condolences with grace, would speak movingly about their love, their years together, the tragedy of losing him too soon. And then she would take the insurance money and move to New York and never look back. The cappuccino was perfect this time, hot and rich and exactly the right amount of bitter. Joan smiled and took another sip, savouring it. Outside, the rainbow flag stirred in a sudden breeze, and the backward door swung open as a customer entered, moving against the flow of logic, against the rules, against everything that was supposed to keep people safe. But Joan wasn't worried about safety anymore. She'd learned something important in these last few months, something her father had never taught her, something her husband had never understood. Sometimes the most dangerous thing in the room isn't the faulty door or the hidden poison or the carefully constructed plan. Sometimes it's the woman sitting quietly in the corner, wool gathering, waiting for fate to do what she'd been too afraid or too smart to do herself. Joan finished her cappuccino and stood to leave. She had a husband to care for after all, a dying man who needed her, and she would be there for him every step of the way, until the very end. It was the least she could do. It was, after all, what a good wife would do.